Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I'll just give Shane a quick introduction here, and then I'll hand it off to him because he's got a lot of information for you guys to hear about today. So Shane Hudson is a senior ergonomist with more than 10 years of field experience. He works for EWI Works International, Inc., which is Western Canada's leading ergonomics and wellness company. Shane holds the designation of CCPE, which is Canadian Certified Professional Ergonomist, and completed his undergraduate and master's degree at the University of Lethbridge with degrees in exercise science and a specific focus on ergonomics. Shane practices in multiple industrial and service settings, including vehicle maintenance, equipment operation, public transit, emergency services, and utility services. Shane has a knack for providing practical solutions that have an immediate impact on reducing musculoskeletal injuries. And with that, Shane, I will pass it on to you.
Thank you, Sydney. Welcome, everybody. So today's presentation, we're going to focus on a couple of things. I'm going to walk through some job demand analysis information, and then we're going to go into a case study. So just here's our agenda for the next 20 or 30 minutes. Again, we've just done an introduction. We're going to go through what is a job demand analysis. I'm going to call them JDAs for short. We'll talk about when they're used. We'll talk about the case study, same but different, why you can't cut corners when evaluating the same job at different locations. Then we'll talk about what are some things that you can do. I'll share some resources, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay. So starting off, what is a job demand analysis? It's basically a tool that is used to identify the physical and cognitive loading of a job. So we as ergonomists will go right to the source. We go and watch workers actually doing their work. We weigh and measure the tools that they actually use. We analyze the frequencies. We look at the postures. We look at the cognitive loading of the tasks. And then we combine that together in a document that is useful at multiple levels. When we think about a job demand analysis, it's important to distinguish between other types of job assessments. So for reference, I'm going to talk about 3 different types of assessments. One that most of us should be familiar with is a field level hazard assessment, also called FLHA. This is typically completed by workers actually completing the job on the day that they're doing a job or a task, and they do it right before a task begins. It's usually reassessed when conditions change, so they should be changing if the weather changes or if a new worker comes on site. And basically, this is for the workers to have their minds on tasks and say, okay, here's some hazards that we might encounter today and how we're going to mitigate them. Those should be done at lots of job sites. Again, nothing really new there. A physical demand assessment, some people call a JDA a physical demand assessment. I'm going to make a distinction here between the two. Physical demand assessment usually is looking at a specific task. Usually there's an observer that's kind of watching what they're doing. And sometimes they're used for task improvement or things like that. They don't really include cognitive aspects of a job. And they might not include the broader scope of everything that a worker does. And so that's where a job demand assessment or JDA comes in. They're typically completed by a trained observer. So a certified ergonomist would be a good example of a trained observer. Somebody who can combine data from all of the tasks that a worker is doing and put them into a document that is understood by a multitude of people. And it includes both the physical and the cognitive data from the job. So we can look at these in a couple different ways. They can be pretty generic. A JDA, a PDA, a FLHA, any of these things could be pretty generic, could be pretty cookie cutter, job description, kind of HR level views with a basic understanding of the tools and equipment that's used, and fairly broad spectrum application. So a good example of a generic kind of job JDA would be like a job description that you would see on a job posting, or if you are coming out of university and trained to be a pilot or a mechanic or something, you'd kind of have the base scope of what it is that that position is supposed to do. Where the specifics gets into it is what that job actually does. So specific to the work being completed, specific to the environment, specific measurements of tools and equipment that are used. So it's a lot stronger focus when we get to the specific level on the actual work environment, the things that are actually being done. And I can't stress that enough, that it's important to know what's actually being done at a location, because as we can see over time, different shops, different locations manage things differently, have different tools, do things differently. And it's important to know those details for the specific work conditions that we're putting people in. When is a JDA used? We get this question all the time. And the answer is it kind of depends on who we're talking to. In an ideal world, doctors, physios, chiros, occupational therapists, they should be using a JDA to quickly understand what a worker does. Return to work coordinators, they should be using these to match what the physical loading and cognitive loading of a job is to help return a worker to full duties. If you look at human resources, this is a good tool to use for pre-employment screening. So an example would be if you have done a JDA and identified some aspects of the job has 75 pounds of lifting required for one person, you could put into pre-employment screening, well, in order to successfully complete this job, we need you to make sure that you can lift 75 pounds safely. Human resources should also be involved in return to work coordination. And if you are an operation that has multiple JDAs, you could potentially say, well, they can't fit here yet, but we could put somebody back to work at least on a reduced physical or cognitive loading in another location. And we know that because these JDAs tell us what the loading is. Supervisors, they should be using these as a good business case to improve tools or equipment. So if a supervisor is aware that a better tool is out there, they might use a JDA to say, hey, we're putting our workers at this level of risk, but this other tool would reduce that risk. And supervisors could also use the JDA in coordination with human resources to help with task modification, to help with selecting work that might be appropriate for a return to work case or things like that. Where JDAs sometimes fall off is they don't always get in front of workers. And this is a great tool to put in front of workers occasionally and give them a reminder of the clear understanding of the risks that they might face. I've probably done close to 100 job demand analysis this year. And I would say that most of the workers that I see have no understanding of how physically demanding their jobs are. They have no understanding of how much something weighs. They'll look at a bag and it'll literally say 22 kilograms, and they'll say, oh yeah, I'm lifting something about 20 pounds. Well, it's actually closer to 50 pounds. So the JDA can help the workers understand their risk, and it can also help them understand and be involved in a process of continual improvement of the work. So let's get into a case study of how this is relevant. This case study I've called Same, Same, but Different: Why You Can't Cut Corners When Evaluating the Same Position at Different Locations. So the job that we're going to look at generically is called the heavy equipment technician position. If you have a fleet of vehicles that are heavier than a pickup, these are what heavy equipment technicians are qualified to work on. So if I ask you all to just close your eyes for a second, and I just want you to visualize, having me said heavy equipment technician, I want you to visualize what it is that person does and what that person looks like. All right. If you have a vision in your mind, great. If you have no idea what a heavy equipment technician looks like, that's okay too. Well, go ahead and open your eyes. Regardless of what your image was, here's what the internet thinks a heavy equipment technician looks like. So possibly guys drinking coffee while the boss is taking a nap, The young new guy is texting his girlfriend or trying to figure out how things work. And obviously the woman is completing all the work. The reality is, this is not going the way I wanted it to. There we go. Now it's playing right. The reality is there's lots of awkward postures. Guys working on creepers, workers on roofs and harnesses. Guys might be inside an engine compartment, using high forces to torque, reaching in awkward places. They might be working in a pit. They might be outside. So again, the perception versus the reality, highly different here, right? So for this case study, in the past couple of years, I've looked at multiple heavy equipment technician sites. I've looked at 6 for this case study. Since this case study, I'm actually working on more heavy equipment technician sites, and the results continue to play into this same story here. 2 of these locations that we're going to talk about, this is auto-playing, and I'm not sure why. Their general purpose. 2 were only transit facilities, so you can imagine city buses. That's what that applies to. One is a shop that only works on fire equipment. Another would be just field only heavy equipment servicing. So the environment, when we look at these 6 locations, the only thing that was same was seasonal temperature extremes. Makes sense, we're in Alberta. When we look at all these other environmental conditions, so if they had smooth floors, not all of them had smooth floors. Only half of the shops had pits. Some of them had fixed hoists, some of them did not, some had portable hoists. One shop even required the guys to work with roof harnesses because of what they were working on. So again, we can see some pretty significant environmental differences just between shops. When we look at the tools, again, all shops have some aspect of each technician has their own tools, but then there's a lot of shops that have communal tools, some that with differences between some that do and some that don't. About half the shops used a service truck. Some of them used a torque wrench for wheel securement. Some of them didn't work on wheels at all. So again, there's these little differences between the types of tools that they're using, not to mention the weight and size of the tools being different within shops as well. Even within shops, there were some interesting differences. So not all of the technicians, for example, would be certified to complete the same tasks. Some didn't have fall arrest, some had to be certified for diesel filter repairs. And if they were doing tire work, you have to have a special certification or training to do tire replacement on rims. And some of these heavy equipment pieces have pretty big tires. The job tasks are also often broken up based on competencies. These might be things like somebody being better at an engine repair, somebody being better at brake replacement, somebody that just prefers to do the visual inspection type stuff. And in the case of fire, things like working on aerials and pumps, again, requiring a special certification, or in the case of aerials, where you're on top of a fire ladder, some guys just don't like working at heights, and so they don't want to do those types of tasks. When we look at the employees, the reality is, despite what the internet says, every single shop that I've been to, the demographic is predominantly male. And this is true of any heavy equipment technician that I've been to. The reality is of the 6 shops that I've looked at in this case study, none of them had an apprentice program. And we know that some shops do, but these shops specifically didn't. And that has the advantage of more experienced workers, but the disadvantage of you've got an aging workforce and nobody to replace them. So you kind of do put your shop at a little bit of risk in that regard. And then again, the work assigned differed by shops. Some preferred the variety of tasks. Other workers would like to do just certain things. And some workers would like more variety, but what they were being assigned by their leadership team wasn't giving them the variety or the experience or other things that boded well for making sure that their system took care of all of their workers' needs. So same story when we look at the cognitive. This scale that you're looking at here, each of these responses are based on a 1 to 4 ranking scale. And again, we can see each of the 6 shops that we looked at, there's differences in the ranking scale on various exposures to cognitive demands, whether it's attention to detail, distractions, time pressures, multitasking. You can see that between each of these shops, there's differences between shops that creates a difference on cognitive loading. The confrontation was kind of interesting that some shops had higher confrontation than others, whereas other shops, because of the way they handled their customers, didn't have as much confrontation in the mix. And then the physical loading, again, these are all, the difference in scales is on the right. So some shops spent a lot of time outside. That makes sense if you're a field shop, but then some of them had kind of a variety based on how their shops were set up. Some shops are really huge. So if you've got 100 bays that you're servicing vehicles at and you're working in bay 100 and the tool crib is at bay 1, you have an awful lot of walking every time you need a tool or a part. Other shops, there's the bays aren't as big or the orientation is different, so the walking is reduced. The torque forces, again, a little bit variable here based on what they are working on. We can see huge variance in the types of the heaviest tires worked, and also huge variance in the largest battery. So some shops sit 130-pound battery, some shops only dealt with equipment that had 50-pound batteries. So when we look at all of these differences, we might say, is this even the same job? And this is a question that I kind of get all the time. Well, I thought it was a heavy equipment technician. It must be the same job. And the answer is it kind of depends on who you're talking to. So if you're talking to healthcare, if you're talking to a doctor who says, oh yeah, I just saw somebody who's a heavy equipment technician, now they see a couple of different JDAs between jobs, they might say, no, it's not the same job at all, but I used to think it was. Human resources, well, again, for a job posting, they might say generically, yeah, it's still the same job. But specifically, a human resource specialist should be able to look at this and say, no, it's really not the same job, and we need the JDA so that we can define what's different at each location. The supervisors probably will say, well, yeah, it's the same job, but ours is different than theirs. We service fire trucks and they service buses. We service tractors and they service bobcats. And the workers who are actually trained to do this job will probably say, no, it's not the same job, but there's similarities. And that is a good thing. We want there to be similarities so that if these workers ever change positions or work within, they're not totally blind knowing how to do a new task on a different piece of equipment. So the question is, what can you do? So I'm going to use the cycle of plan, do, review, so that you can get a good sense of what it is you should do to implement JDAs, and more specifically, make sure that you're capturing the details at each environment that you might have the same types of jobs, even though they've got different managers or different tools or things. What can you do? Let's look at plan, do, review. For this time of year, review is actually where we should start. We're nearing the end of Q3. For a lot of organizations, this is when you're trying to pitch some plans for next year. So what you should do is look at your current status. Do you have JDAs for each position? If you don't, do you have a plan to make them? If you do, are your JDAs up to date? And by up to date, I mean less than 5 years old. The reason I use 5 years old is because over a 5-year period, maybe a few things have changed, such as maybe you've introduced some new tools, maybe you've introduced some new business practices. Over a 1 to 2 year period, there might be significant changes worth updating, but usually the convention that we're currently using is if they're less than 5 years old, they're probably current enough that they're still a really useful tool. If they're more than 5 years old, then you should at least look at them to see if they need to be refreshed. And then review who has access to these JDAs. Do your healthcare providers, human resources, do people know how to access them, and are they applicable to the job that they're accessing? Once you've gone through the review process, this is a good time after that to make a plan to address the gaps. We should be identifying where you're putting frontline workers are at risk. This is a good time to build put into your budget, building JDAs into your operating budget. So again, where a lot of companies are, where a lot of municipalities are right now in their third quarter cycle, they should be submitting budgets for 2023, and this is would be fall into making a plan so that in 2023 you can capture some of these JDAs that you're identifying as a gap. And if you're unsure on any of this process, this is a good time to contact and engage an ergonomist, understand the data collection process, understand what it is we do to come in and give you this tool so that you can be current and up to date. And then obviously, once we've done the plan and the review and the plan, then it's committing, do commit to complete, I can't talk, commit to completing an ongoing JDA process. So this again is where you should work with a trained professional, i.e. an ergonomist, schedule data collection for those priority jobs, making data available to relevant users, and then using the JDAs as a tool to proactively improve your processes. So a good example of this would be improving a tool would be getting a job assessed, realizing that you have an old or an outdated tool, using the JDA to build a business case to say, hey, let's get a better tool to do that job, and then revisiting the JDA and saying, hey, did that improve the job? So all those things, this plan, do, review, those are all things that you can do to drive the JDA process forward. So you've probably seen some of our resources before at ewiworks.com. Just encourage you to reach out and check that out. And you're welcome to contact me, shudson at ewiworks.com. I'm going to open it up for any questions.